They told me it was a simple project, a preservation study for my dissertation. Hollow Creek Sanatorium, tucked away in a forgotten corner of the Appalachian wilderness, had been abandoned for decades. Its walls, they said, held stories of a bygone era of mental health care, stories I wanted to unearth. What no one told me, and perhaps no one knew, was that some stories don't stay silent. They bleed, weep, and echo until someone is brave or foolish enough to listen. The journey began on a crisp autumn morning, my rental car crawling along mountain roads that grew increasingly narrow and treacherous. The locals in the last town I'd passed through had given me strange looks when I'd mentioned Hollow Creek. One elderly man at the gas station had gripped my arm with surprising strength, his rheumy eyes intense. "That place," he'd said, shaking his head, "it ain't right. Never was." I'd smiled politely and pulled away, but his words echoed in my mind as I drove deeper into the wilderness. The hike to the sanatorium alone was grueling. My GPS barely worked in the thick forest, the signal fluctuating wildly before dying completely. The old access road was little more than a trail choked by wild brush, thorns catching at my clothes like grasping fingers. My gear felt heavier with every step, and I had to stop twice to catch my breath as the altitude climbed. The air grew thinner, carrying an odd metallic taste that coated my tongue. Birds fell silent as I ascended, their absence leaving an unnatural void in the forest's symphony. When I finally emerged from the trees, the building loomed like a skeletal giant, its red brick facade darkened by years of rain and neglect. Vines crawled up the sides like veins on a corpse, and its shattered windows gaped like toothless mouths, frozen in silent screams. The air felt colder here, though I couldn't say why. A peculiar stillness hung over the grounds, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath. I brushed off the unease as simple nerves, though my hands trembled slightly as I checked my camera equipment. I wasn't new to this sort of thing, documenting forgotten spaces, delving into history, but Hollow Creek felt different, even then. There was a weight to the silence, a density to the shadows that seemed to defy natural law. Inside, the place was a maze of peeling paint, rusted bed frames, and papers strewn across the floors like dead leaves. The smell of mildew and decay hung heavy, undercut by something else, something chemical and sharp that made my eyes water. Each step I took sent echoes skittering down the empty halls, the sound returning distorted, as if the building were playing it back wrong. Shadows seemed to move at the corners of my vision, retreating just as I turned to look at them directly. My job was straightforward: catalog artifacts, photograph the site, and document any historical clues for my dissertation. The sanatorium had operated during the 1940s and 50s, specializing in patients with schizophrenia, back when treatments were often cruel and experimental. Electroshock therapy, insulin comas, even experimental surgeries that left patients shells of their former selves. It was a dark chapter in medical history, and I wanted to uncover the human stories hidden within those walls. Looking back, I wonder if some stories are better left buried. The first 2 days were uneventful, though marked by an increasing sense of disquiet that I couldn't shake. I set up camp in what had been the administrative wing, the only area with a relatively intact roof. The linoleum floors were warped but solid, and the old desk I used as a makeshift table still held firm. My sleeping bag looked absurdly modern against the decay, a splash of bright synthetic color in a world of faded browns and grays. My days were spent sifting through moldy patient files and photographing graffiti-covered walls. The graffiti caught my attention early. Some of it was crude, left by vandals over the years, but other parts seemed older, more deliberate. Carvings in the plaster, shapes that resembled eyes, spirals, jagged lines that formed patterns that seemed to shift when viewed too long. Some appeared to have been carved with fingernails, the grooves still holding traces of what might have been blood. I made a note of it, but chalked it up to patients expressing themselves in whatever limited ways they could, though the patterns haunted my dreams that night. The nights were different. The sounds of the forest seemed muted here, as if the building swallowed them whole. The darkness was absolute, my battery-powered lantern creating a small island of light that seemed to emphasize the void beyond rather than dispel it. And sometimes, just at the edge of hearing, I thought I caught whispers, too faint to make out, but persistent enough to raise the hairs on my neck. They seemed to come from within the walls themselves, a susurration of voices speaking in overlapping waves. I told myself it was the wind, or my mind playing tricks in the isolation, but deep down, I knew better. The whispers had a quality to them, an urgency that no natural sound could mimic. On the third day, I found the recordings. They were buried beneath a pile of patient files in a basement storage room, alongside crumbling notebooks and empty jars that may have once held medications. The air was thick with dust and the musty smell of rotting paper. The reel-to-reel tapes were surprisingly intact, their labels faded, but legible in my flashlight beam. Most were mundane: patient interviews, progress reports, medical notes documenting the slow descent of minds into chaos. But one tape stood out. The label simply read, Room 12, Final Recording. Something about the simplicity of that label unnerved me, the way the ink had bled into the paper, making the numbers look like they were melting. Back in my makeshift camp, I set up an old portable tape recorder I'd brought for research. The machine hummed to life, its mechanisms clicking softly in the silence. I pressed play, and the room filled with static, a white noise that seemed to carry whispers within it. Then came a voice, cracked and wavering, tinged with something that might have been fear. "This is Dr. Malcolm Gray, attending physician for patient 129, Jonathan K. I'm recording this as a final entry. The experiments have gone beyond what I intended." There was a long pause, filled only with the sound of heavy breathing. The patient claims the walls speak to him, that they tell him things I cannot hear. I thought it was delusion, but then the tape hissed violently, and I leaned closer, straining to hear. Then I heard it too. They're in there in the walls. They've always been there waiting. We didn't build this place. We just gave them what they wanted. Bodies, minds, souls. Another pause, shorter this time. God forgive us. The recording ended abruptly, leaving me in a silence that felt alive. I sat in the darkness, the weight of his words settling over me like a shroud. The walls speak? I told myself it was nonsense, the ramblings of a doctor who'd lost his grip on reality. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. The whispers I'd been hearing seemed louder now, more deliberate, as if they knew I'd discovered their secret. I played the tape again and again, trying to catch something in the background, some clue that might explain what Dr. Gray had experienced. On the fourth replay, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Beneath the doctor's voice, barely audible, was a sound like fingernails scraping against plaster, and something that might have been laughter. That night, I dreamed of voices. They weren't speaking to me exactly. It was more like they were whispering to each other, their words just beyond the edge of comprehension. The dream voices spoke of pain, of experiments that went beyond the physical, of a hunger that could never be satisfied. When I woke, my heart was racing, and I felt certain I wasn't alone. The darkness pressed against my eyes like a physical thing, and the air felt thick, almost liquid. I lay in the dark, listening, but the only sound was the distant creak of the building settling, or perhaps something else, something moving through the halls with deliberate purpose. Still, the sense of unease clung to me like a second skin, and I could have sworn I felt breath on the back of my neck, though I was pressed against the wall. The following day, I decided to investigate room 12. The decision felt less like choice and more like compulsion, as if the room itself were calling to me. It wasn't hard to find. Someone had scratched the number into the peeling paint of the doorframe, the digits deep and savage, as if carved in desperation. The corridor leading to it was colder than the rest of the building, and my flashlight beam seemed to dim as I approached. Inside, the room was almost bare, stripped of everything except memory and pain. A rusted bed frame sat in one corner, its restraints still attached, leather straps cracked and stained with something dark. The walls were covered in jagged gouges, as if someone, or something, had clawed at them in desperation. My flashlight beam caught something strange. Faint symbols etched into the plaster. They were uneven, almost frantic, and the longer I looked, the more I felt an odd sense of familiarity. Had I seen these shapes before? In dreams, perhaps, or in some half-remembered nightmare? I couldn't place them, but they seemed to pulse with a faint, sickly light that might have been a trick of my flashlight. As I traced one of the carvings with my finger, I heard it. A whisper. Clearer this time. "Help." I froze, my hand trembling against the wall. The plaster felt warm beneath my fingers, almost feverish, and I could have sworn I felt a pulse beneath it, like a heart beating in a malformed chest. "Hello?" I called out, my voice thin and shaky. The room answered with silence, but it was a silence that felt expectant, hungry. I stepped back, suddenly aware of how small the room felt, how the walls seemed to lean inward like curious observers. The air grew thick, making each breath a struggle. I wanted to leave. Every instinct screamed at me to pack up and go, to put as much distance between myself and this place as possible. But I stayed. Something about the sanatorium, its silence, its secrets, had a grip on me that went beyond academic curiosity. It was as if the building itself had sunk hooks into my mind, drawing me deeper into its mysteries. That evening, I played the tape again, hoping to catch something I'd missed. As the static hissed, I thought I heard something in the background. A low, rhythmic sound, like breathing, but not quite human. It wasn't on the tape before, or maybe I hadn't noticed it. The sound seemed to sync with my own breathing, matching it beat for beat until I couldn't tell which was the recording and which was real. When I turned off the recorder, the breathing didn't stop. It continued, growing louder, closer, until it seemed to come from just behind me. I didn't dare turn around. The final night was the worst. I had packed my things, determined to leave at first light, but sleep wouldn't come. The whispers were louder now, circling my makeshift camp like hungry wolves, rising and falling like the tide. Words began to form in the chaos. Please, help, run, stay, join us. Each one dripping with a desperate need that made my skin crawl. And then I heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate, moving down the hall toward me. They weren't the random creaks of an old building. These were purposeful, measured, the sound of something that knew exactly where it was going. I grabbed my flashlight and bolted upright, shining the beam into the darkness. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The footsteps stopped, but the whispers didn't. They grew louder, more insistent, overlapping in a chaotic chorus of need and pain and hunger. I backed into the corner, clutching the flashlight like a weapon, though I knew it would be useless against whatever was out there. The light flickered, then died, leaving me in a darkness so complete it felt solid. In the pitch black, I felt the walls pressing in. The whispers turned to screams, a cacophony of voices pleading, sobbing, accusing. They spoke of treatments that went beyond medicine, of experiments that touched the soul, of a darkness that had been there long before the sanatorium was built. And beneath it all, a low, guttural sound that wasn't human, couldn't be human, a sound that spoke of appetites that could never be satisfied. I stumbled blindly, my hands searching for the door, the cold plaster burning against my fingertips as though it were alive. The walls seemed to pulse beneath my touch, and I could have sworn I felt something moving within them, pressing back against my hands with an eager, hungry pressure. I found the doorway and ran, my footsteps echoing in the hallways like gunshots. Each echo came back wrong, distorted, as if the building were mocking my attempt to escape. I didn't stop until I was outside, standing in the damp grass, gasping for air that didn't taste of decay and madness. When dawn broke, I was still there, staring at the sanatorium. In the early morning light, it looked almost innocent. Just another abandoned building slowly being reclaimed by nature. But I knew better now. I knew what lived in those walls, what waited in the darkness for someone to listen. I don't remember running, but I must have. My hands were scraped, my knees bruised, and my clothes were torn as if something had tried to hold me back. I didn't go back for my gear. I couldn't. The thought of entering those halls again made my heart stutter in my chest. I just left, stumbling down the overgrown path until I found my car, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the keys. I reported what I'd found to the university, but they dismissed it as nerves or exhaustion. The official explanation was that I'd succumbed to the isolation, that the stress of solo fieldwork had gotten to me. They sent another researcher to retrieve my abandoned equipment, but he returned empty-handed, claiming he couldn't find any trace of my camp. The sanatorium remains untouched, its secrets rotting away in silence. But I know they're not rotting. They're growing, feeding, waiting for the next person brave or foolish enough to listen. Sometimes late at night I hear it again, that whisper, faint, persistent, carried on the edge of dreams. It speaks of loneliness, of hunger, of needs that can never be fulfilled. Help. And I wonder if Hollow Creek is still calling for me, its patience as endless as its appetite. I wonder how many others have heard that call, how many have felt the pull of those whispering walls. And sometimes, in my darkest moments, I wonder if part of me is still there, trapped in room 12, adding my voice to the chorus of the damned. The worst part isn't the memories, or the nightmares, or even the whispers that still plague my dreams. The worst part is knowing that Hollow Creek Sanatorium is still there, waiting in its corner of the Appalachians, its walls growing thicker with secrets, its hunger never satisfied. And sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I see symbols carved into my skin, faint but growing clearer every day, matching the patterns I saw in room 12. They whisper to me, promising answers if I just come back, just listen, just stay a little longer this time. And God help me, some days I almost want to go. They called it St. Amara's Chapel, a small stone church built in the late 1600s. It sat forgotten on the edge of the countryside, nestled at the base of a hill where wildflowers choked the old, crumbling path. The parish had abandoned it centuries ago, during a bloody local uprising that had left the surrounding fields stained with the blood of both rebels and loyalists. The details of that dark chapter had been lost to time, preserved only in fragments of local folklore and the occasional whispered conversation in village taverns. No one lived near it anymore, and no one spoke of it except to pass along whispered warnings or fleeting tales of its cursed history. Over the years, various attempts had been made to breathe life back into the decaying structure. Local historical societies, ambitious architects, even wealthy patrons had tried their hand at restoration, but each project met the same fate. Workers would abandon their tools mid-task, leaving scaffolding to rust and supplies to rot. Some claimed illness drove them away. Others spoke of nightmares that left them trembling and sleepless, but none would return to complete the work. The diocese had watched these failed attempts with growing concern, torn between preserving their heritage and acknowledging the chapel's seemingly cursed nature. That's why they sent me, Father Wallace, the youngest and newest priest in the diocese. Perhaps they thought my youth would make me less susceptible to superstition, Or maybe they simply considered me expendable. When I arrived on that overcast autumn morning, I could see why the chapel had earned its reputation. Its stone walls jutted from the earth like broken teeth, weathered and darkened by time. Years of exposure had turned the once golden limestone a mottled gray, streaked with black stains that resembled tears running down a mourner's face. The stained glass windows were intact, but the images were faded, nearly bleached out by centuries of sunlight. What remained of the biblical scenes depicted within were distorted. The faces of saints and angels warped into unsettling expressions that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. Vines coiled up the walls like veins, their thick stems pushing between the stones with an almost organic persistence. The large oak door, once a masterpiece of medieval craftsmanship, sagged under its own weight, its iron hinges orange with rust. The door's surface bore deep scratches near its base, as though something had tried desperately to claw its way in or out. As I stood before it, a strange chill passed over me, despite the mild temperature. The air felt thick, almost viscous, carrying an odd metallic taste that reminded me of old pennies. I wasn't one to give in to superstitions. My seminary training had emphasized reason and faith over folklore, but something about the place felt heavy, wrong even. The silence was absolute, unnatural. No birds sang in the nearby trees, no insects buzzed in the tall grass. Even the wind seemed to die away as it approached the chapel's walls. I told myself it was just my imagination, a reaction to the isolation and the morbid stories I'd heard. I had a job to do, and I didn't want to waste time indulging in paranoid fantasies. Pushing open the door required more strength than I'd anticipated. The wood groaned in protest, a sound that seemed to contain centuries of pain and neglect. A waft of stale air rushed out, carrying with it the musty scent of decay and something else, something sweeter, almost cloying, like incense mixed with rotting flowers. The inside of the chapel was dim, lit only by thin streams of light filtering through the cracked, stained glass. These beams created strange patterns on the floor, geometric shapes that seemed to pulse and shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. Pews lined the floor, many broken or covered in thick layers of dust that bore no footprints save my own. The wood had warped over time, twisting into shapes that reminded me of writhing bodies. Here and there, I could see small carvings in the wood, crude symbols and initials, some recent, others so old they had nearly worn away. But among these typical marks of vandalism were other, more disturbing etchings. Eyes, dozens of them, carved with precise detail, all seeming to stare in the same direction, toward the altar. The altar at the front still stood, a slab of weathered stone with faint carvings on its surface. As I walked down the aisle, my footsteps echoed strangely, as though the space around me were larger than it seemed. Each step produced multiple echoes, some delayed, others coming from directions that didn't make architectural sense. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, though I knew I was alone. The air grew colder as I approached the altar, and I found myself pulling my jacket tighter around my shoulders. My task was to inspect the structure and document its condition for the diocese. I spent the first hour taking notes on the crumbling plaster, the warped wood of the pews, and the scattered debris littering the floor. My pen scratched across the paper, the sound unnaturally loud in the chapel's stillness. Every few minutes I would pause, certain I'd heard something, a sigh, a whisper, the soft scuff of feet on stone, only to be met with silence when I lifted my head to listen. My unease grew when I noticed something odd. Graffiti on the walls, faint and nearly hidden under layers of grime. At first, I thought it was the work of vandals, but the symbols weren't the sort of crude scribbles or spray-painted names I'd expected. They were intricate, almost geometric, carved deep into the stone with a precision that suggested hours of careful work. Some formed perfect circles. Others created complex patterns that seemed to shift and move when viewed from the corner of my eye. I took a closer look and found Latin phrases etched among the symbols, the letters flowing between and around the geometric designs. They were prayers, or at least fragments of them, though some were unfamiliar to me. Others seemed wrong, twisted versions of common blessings, as though they had been intentionally altered. Where "deliver us from evil" should have been, I found "deliver us to evil." "Lead us not into temptation" had become "lead us into eternal temptation." The more I read, the more my head began to ache, a dull throbbing behind my eyes that grew stronger with each corrupted phrase I deciphered. I noted them down and decided to investigate the altar. It was cracked but intact, with faint engravings of crosses and floral patterns on its edges. The stone was cool to the touch, unnaturally so, as though it were drawing heat from my fingers. When I stepped closer, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. The stone surface was stained, darkened in a way that suggested it had absorbed something over the years. Blood, perhaps. The stains formed patterns, subtle but distinct, that reminded me of faces in agony. It was probably the result of an old ritual or sacrifice from the chapel's early days, back when folklore and religion blurred together in the countryside. The local peasants might have brought offerings here, seeking protection from plague or famine. Still, I couldn't help but feel a deep unease. The air in the chapel felt heavier now, as though the building itself were watching me, aware of my presence and my scrutiny of its secrets. I tried to shake the feeling and focus on my work, but as the afternoon wore on, I became increasingly distracted. The chapel was silent, eerily so, with no sounds of birds or wind outside. And yet, I kept hearing faint noises just at the edge of perception, shuffling footsteps, whispers, the distant creak of wood. At first, I thought it was the building settling, but the sounds grew more distinct as the day went on. They seemed to follow me as I moved through the space, always just behind me or around the next corner. When I turned to investigate, there was nothing there, but the air would be noticeably colder, carrying that sweet rotting smell I'd noticed earlier. The shadows began to deepen as the day progressed, stretching across the stone walls like grasping fingers. They seemed to move against the light, reaching toward me when I wasn't looking directly at them. I found myself avoiding certain corners of the chapel, places where the darkness felt thicker, more substantial. The stained glass windows cast colored light across the floor, but the images they created looked less like religious scenes and more like abstract shapes that suggested faces, bodies, things moving in the dark. By the time the sun began to set, my nerves were frayed. I had planned to leave before dark, but a storm had rolled in, dark clouds hanging low over the hills like a funeral shroud. The first drops of rain hit the windows with unusual force, sounding less like water and more like fingernails tapping on glass. Lightning flickered in the distance, illuminating the chapel in brief, stark bursts that made the shadows dance and leap. I decided it would be safer to wait out the storm inside, though every instinct screamed at me to leave, to run, to put as much distance between myself and this place as possible. I lit a lantern I'd brought and set it on one of the pews, its warm glow pushing back the encroaching darkness. The flame flickered erratically, though there was no draft I could feel. Sometimes it would dim almost to nothing, then flare up suddenly, casting wild shadows that seemed to take on forms. Robed figures, reaching hands, faces pressed against invisible windows. As the storm raged outside, the noises grew louder, more insistent. The whispers became clearer, though I couldn't understand the words. They sounded like a language I didn't know, their tone hushed and urgent, like secrets being shared in the dark. Sometimes I thought I could almost grasp their meaning, but understanding slipped away like water through my fingers, leaving only a sense of dread and wrongness. I stood in the center of the chapel, turning in circles, my lantern casting wild shadows on the walls. The light seemed to catch on the carved symbols, making them appear to move, to crawl across the stone like insects. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice echoing back at me in strange ways, as though the chapel were much larger than its physical dimensions suggested. There was no answer, only the continuing whispers and the sound of rain hammering against the windows with increasing fury. I walked toward the altar, trying to steady my breathing, but the whispers followed me, growing louder, closer. They seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the walls, from the floor, from the very air around me. My head throbbed with each syllable, and that sickly sweet smell grew stronger, making my stomach churn. Then, all at once, they stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, absolute. Even the storm outside seemed muted, distant, as though the chapel existed in its own pocket of reality. My ears strained for any sound, but the only thing I could hear was the pounding of my own heart and the rush of blood in my ears. The air felt thick, pressurized, like the moment before a thunderclap. I turned to leave, and that's when I saw it. At the back of the chapel, near the door, stood a figure. It was cloaked in shadow, its face obscured, but I could see the outline of its body, tall and thin, unnaturally so. It didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stood there, watching me with an intensity I could feel like a physical weight. The darkness around it seemed deeper, more absolute, as though it were drawing in what little light remained in the chapel. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. I took a step forward, holding the lantern higher, but as the light reached the back of the chapel, the figure vanished. One moment it was there, and the next, it was gone, leaving only a cold spot in the air and that lingering, sweet rot smell. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the lantern. My breathing was ragged, panic clawing at the edges of my mind. I wanted to leave, to run out into the storm, but something held me in place. I felt rooted to the spot, unable to tear my eyes away from the place where the figure had stood. The shadows there seemed to writhe and twist, suggesting shapes that my mind refused to process. That's when I heard the footsteps. They came from behind me, slow and deliberate, moving down the aisle toward the altar. Each step echoed on the stone floor, with a weight that suggested something far larger than human. I spun around, my lantern swinging wildly, the light catching on the dust motes that hung unnaturally still in the air. But there was no one there. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just a few feet away. I felt a presence then, heavy and oppressive, as though someone, or something, were standing right in front of me. The whispers began again, this time in my ear, so close I could feel cold breath on my skin. The words were clearer now, though I still couldn't understand them. They sounded like a prayer, but one spoken in reverse. The words twisted and broken, forming patterns that hurt my mind to hear. My head began to ache, a sharp, pulsing pain that made my vision blur. Spots of darkness danced at the edges of my sight, taking on shapes that suggested things I'd seen in the stained glass, in the carvings on the walls. I dropped to my knees, clutching my temples, the whispers growing louder and louder, until they were deafening. The pain in my head built to a crescendo, and with it came images, flashes of the chapel's past, perhaps, or visions planted there by whatever presence filled this cursed place. I saw robed figures performing rituals at the altar, heard screams that might have been prayers, smelled blood and incense and decay. The images came faster, more fragmented, faces twisted in ecstasy or agony, hands reaching up from beneath the floor, shadows that moved against the light and took on solid form. And then, as suddenly as they began, they stopped. I opened my eyes and found myself alone in the chapel. The lantern had gone out, leaving me in near darkness. The storm outside had quieted to a gentle rain, but the air inside still felt heavy, oppressive, charged with potential. I stood slowly, my legs shaking, and made my way to the door. I didn't look back as I left. I couldn't. I was afraid of what I might see, or what might see me. I returned to the diocese the next day, my report incomplete. I told them the structure was unsound, that it was unsafe for further inspection. I spoke of structural damage, of water infiltration, of the risk of collapse. All true, but none of it the real reason why the chapel should be left alone. I didn't mention the whispers, the figure, or the strange symbols. I didn't tell them about the footsteps, or the visions, or the way the shadows had moved against the light. I wasn't sure they'd believe me, and to be honest, I wasn't sure I believed it myself. But late at night, when the world is quiet, I sometimes hear those whispers again. They come to me in dreams, or in those moments between sleeping and waking when reality feels thin and permeable. They're faint, distorted, like a prayer gone wrong, carrying echoes of whatever dwells in that ancient chapel. And I wonder if St. Amara's chapel is still standing, its secrets buried within its crumbling walls, waiting for someone else to listen. Sometimes, I catch myself tracing patterns in the air, recreating those strange symbols I saw carved into the stone. In these moments, I understand why the restoration workers fled, why the local people warned their children away, why the diocese has left it standing all these years. Some places are meant to remain forgotten, some doors are meant to stay closed, and some prayers are better left unspoken. Yet I know the chapel isn't finished with me. In my darker moments, I fear it never will be. For I've begun to notice things, symbols appearing in my notebooks that I don't remember drawing, whispered conversations in languages I don't know, shadows that move when they shouldn't. And sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I see something standing behind me, tall and thin and cloaked in shadow, watching, waiting, patient as only the truly ancient can be. When it came to urban exploration, we were usually careful, methodical even. We'd research locations for weeks, map out entry points, and always have backup plans. But the old Briarwood textile factory on the outskirts of town was too good to pass up, despite the red flags that should have warned us away. It had been abandoned since the 1950s, after a devastating fire destroyed a large portion of the structure and forced its closure. The stories surrounding it were vague and grim. Unexplained disappearances, mysterious suicides, and financial ruin seemed to plague everyone tied to it. Workers who survived the fire refused to speak about their experiences, and local historians noted strange gaps in the factory's records. For years, the factory had loomed over the surrounding fields, like a broken monument to an era best forgotten, its blackened walls a testament to tragedy. We'd been planning the trip for weeks, studying old blueprints and collecting fragments of its history. No splitting up, Ryan, our de facto leader, said as we stood before the rusted gates, his voice carrying an unusual edge of tension. This place is huge, and the floor plans show at least 3 sub-basements we need to watch out for. No problem there, I muttered, clutching my camera tighter, its familiar weight offering little comfort. I wasn't a fan of being alone in places like this, and Briarwood had an air of menace even in the afternoon light. The skeletal remains of its machinery loomed in the distance, visible through cracked windows and gaping holes in the brick walls. Even from here, I could see the scorch marks that climbed the building's facade like dark fingers reaching for the sky. Besides me were Ryan, a seasoned thrill-seeker who lived for these expeditions and had an uncanny knack for finding the most unsettling locations, Tasha, our tech-savvy map reader, whose collection of detailed floor plans had saved us more than once, and Liz, the team's skeptical voice of reason, who'd talked us out of more dangerous situations than I cared to count. Together, We'd explored abandoned hospitals with morgues still intact, crumbling mansions with mysterious locked rooms, and forgotten tunnels that seemed to lead nowhere. But Briarwood felt different. There was a heaviness to the air, a thickness that made each breath feel like work. The gates were surprisingly easy to push open, their hinges moving silently despite decades of exposure. We slipped through, our footsteps crunching on overgrown weeds and shattered glass that carpeted the ground like deadly confetti. The interior smelled of mildew and rot, a damp cold seeping into my bones despite the summer heat outside. The contrast between the warm sun at our backs and the chill emanating from the building was jarring, unnatural. "Stick together," Ryan reminded us as he swept his flashlight beam over the cavernous space. Dust motes danced in the air, catching the light like tiny stars in a dead galaxy. The beam revealed patches of blackened walls, testament to the fire that had claimed the building decades ago. The floor was strewn with debris, shredded papers that crumbled at the slightest touch, rusty tools scattered like abandoned weapons, and broken furniture twisted into unnatural shapes. Faded posters hung on the walls, their slogans barely legible through layers of grime. Briarwood, where quality meets craftsmanship. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. "Looks like the apocalypse happened here," Liz said, kicking a rusted wrench across the floor. The sound echoed unnaturally long in the vast space, as if the building itself was savoring the noise. We moved cautiously, stopping every now and then to document the decay. My camera captured peeling paint that curled like burning paper, graffiti scrawled in languages I didn't recognize, some looking more like symbols than actual writing, and long-forgotten machinery encrusted with rust that resembled dried blood in the dim light. The flash illuminated corners that seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it. But it wasn't until we reached the administrative wing that we realized something was fundamentally wrong with this place. Tasha was the first to notice it. A faint scratching noise coming from the far end of the hall, like fingernails on concrete. She froze, her flashlight beam trembling slightly, creating dancing shadows on the walls that seemed to move independently of the light's motion. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of our breathing. We all stopped, listening. The sound was faint, but distinct. A rhythmic scrape, like metal dragging across concrete, or something much worse, trying to dig its way out. It had a pattern to it, almost like Morse code, but twisted and wrong. "Probably an animal," Ryan said, but his voice lacked conviction. His usual confidence had evaporated, replaced by something that sounded suspiciously like fear. "Or the wind," Liz offered, though there wasn't even a breeze outside. The air in the factory was dead, stagnant, as if it hadn't moved since the day the fires died. "Let's check it out," Ryan said, moving toward the noise with a determination that seemed more like resignation than courage. The corridor narrowed, the walls closing in around us like a throat constricting. Offices lined the hall, their doors hanging off their hinges at angles that defied gravity. Papers and ledgers littered the floor, creating a carpet of forgotten lives and broken dreams. The musty smell of decay was stronger here, mixed with something else, something chemical and acrid that burned the back of my throat. Ryan pushed the door open, and our flashlights illuminated a small office filled with filing cabinets, arranged in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate. One of the drawers was half open, and something was moving inside it, creating shadows that danced across the rusted metal. "Rats," Liz said, exhaling in relief, but her voice trembled with uncertainty. But when Ryan yanked the drawer open, there was nothing there. Nothing visible, at least, though the movement continued for a moment before stopping abruptly, as if whatever was causing it had suddenly become aware of our presence. The room fell silent, the air heavy with tension. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and a cold sensation crept down my spine like ice water. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees in an instant. "Let's keep moving," Tasha said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. We made our way deeper into the factory, passing through what had once been the main production floor. Rows of rusting looms and spinning machines stood like forgotten giants, their metal skeletons draped in cobwebs that seemed too thick, too organized to be natural. Our footsteps echoed eerily in the vast space, sometimes seeming to continue even when we stood still. Then I saw it, writing scrawled across one of the machines. It was faint, scratched into the metal with something sharp and desperate, but unmistakable in its urgency. "Get out, before they find you." I snapped a photo, my hands shaking so badly I had to brace against the machine. The metal was ice cold beneath my fingers, despite the humid air. "Guys, look at this." They crowded around, their expressions darkening as they read the warning. The scratches in the metal looked fresh, the edges still sharp enough to catch the light. "Who's they?" Liz asked, her skepticism finally cracking under the weight of our surroundings. "Probably just a prank," Ryan said, though he looked uneasy, his usual bravado completely gone. "Other explorers messing with us." But we all knew that the dust around the machine was undisturbed, no footprints marking the floor except our own. We moved on, but the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. The factory felt oppressive now, as though it were watching us with malevolent intent. The deeper we went, the more we found. Graffiti on the walls, cryptic phrases scratched into surfaces with increasing desperation. "They're still here. Don't listen to them. Turn back now." Each message seemed fresher than the last, the metal still bright where it had been carved away. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe, tasting of copper and ash. Tasha stopped suddenly, shining her flashlight on the floor. "Do you see that?" Her voice was barely a whisper, as if she were afraid of being overheard. We followed her beam to a series of footprints in the dust. They were fresh, leading away from us into the darkness. But something was wrong with them. The spacing was too wide, the impressions too deep, as if whoever or whatever had made them had been running from something terrible. "Is someone else here?" Liz asked, her voice rising in pitch, fear finally overwhelming her rational mind. Ryan hesitated, then shook his head. "Could be someone passing through. Let's just stay together." But we all noticed how he positioned himself between us and the direction the footprints led, his free hand clenched into a tight fist. The tension was palpable as we followed the footprints, drawn forward by a morbid curiosity none of us could resist. They led to a staircase spiraling down into the basement, each step marked by dark stains that looked disturbingly like blood in our flashlight beams. The air grew colder as we descended, the smell of damp earth mingling with something acrid, like burned fabric, and something else, something organic and wrong. The basement was worse than the floors above, a nightmare of concrete and steel. Pipes crisscrossed the ceiling like metallic veins, leaking water onto the cracked concrete below. But the liquid that dripped seemed too thick, too dark to be just water. Puddles reflected our flashlight beams in ways that made no sense, showing images that couldn't possibly be there. In the distance, a low hum filled the air, as though the factory were still alive, its ancient machinery still running somewhere in the darkness. Then we found the doors. Massive and rusted, they stood at the far end of the room like the entrance to a tomb, flanked by strange symbols scratched into the walls. The symbols seemed to shift when viewed directly, forming patterns that hurt the eyes and made my head spin. The footprints led straight to them, but the doors themselves were chained shut with links that looked far too new against the ancient metal. "What's back there?" Tasha asked, her flashlight beam trembling as it played across the surface of the doors. "Only one way to find out," Ryan said, gripping the chains with hands that shook despite his determined expression. "No," Liz said firmly, grabbing his arm. "This is a bad idea. Let's just leave." Her voice carried a note of genuine terror I'd never heard before. But Ryan had already pulled out a bolt cutter from his backpack. With a grunt, he snapped the chains, and the doors groaned open with a sound like a dying animal. The smell that wafted out was indescribable, a mixture of decay, chemicals, and something sweet and cloying that made my stomach turn. Beyond them was a smaller room, lined with shelves filled with dusty boxes and jars that seemed to absorb our flashlight beams. In the center was a table, its surface scarred with knife marks and dark stains that formed patterns too regular to be random. The air was thick with decades of dust, but something had disturbed it recently. Fresh handprints marked the table's surface. "What is this place?" I whispered, taking a step closer despite every instinct screaming at me to run. Tasha picked up one of the jars, squinting at the faded label through the grimy glass. "It's a sample. Cotton, I think." But her voice wavered with uncertainty. "No, it's not," Liz said, her voice shaking as she shone her light through the glass. "Look closer." We all leaned in, and my stomach churned violently. Inside the jar was a lock of hair, human hair, arranged in a spiral pattern that seemed to move when you weren't looking directly at it. Other jars contained similar specimens, each labeled with dates and names that had long since faded into illegibility. "Let's get out of here," Liz said, backing away from the shelves. But her movement was arrested by a sound from behind us. A soft click, like a lock engaging. But before we could move, the lights flickered. Not our flashlights, but actual electrical lights in the ceiling, ancient bulbs suddenly burning with a sickly yellow glow. A deafening metallic crash echoed behind us, and the doors slammed shut with devastating finality. We were plunged into darkness as our flashlights died simultaneously, leaving us in a blackness so complete it felt solid. Panic set in as we scrambled for the door, but it wouldn't budge. Something moved in the shadows, a faint whisper, like voices just out of reach, speaking words that made no sense, but filled me with a primal terror. The air grew thick with the smell of burning cotton and something metallic. "Tasha!" Ryan shouted. His flashlight suddenly sputtered back to life, revealing her standing frozen, her eyes wide with terror, fixed on something in the darkness behind us that we couldn't see. "They're here," she whispered. Her voice changed, deeper, as if something else were speaking through her. The whispers grew louder, and the room seemed to close in around us. The air grew stifling, and I felt an unbearable weight pressing down on my chest, like being crushed by an invisible hand. The walls pulsed with a light that shouldn't exist, revealing glimpses of shapes that defied description. "Move!" Ryan shouted, shoving the door with all his strength. It finally gave way with a screech of tortured metal, and we spilled into the basement, gasping for air that tasted of ash and copper. We didn't stop running until we were outside, the factory looming behind us like a vengeful god, its windows seeming to watch our retreat with malevolent satisfaction. None of us spoke as we climbed into Ryan's car and sped away, the engine protesting as he pushed it well beyond the speed limit. I still don't know what happened in Briarwood that day, but I haven't been back since. The photos I took show nothing unusual. No footprints, no writing, no symbols. Just a crumbling factory, its secrets buried in dust and shadow. But sometimes, when I look at them late at night, I swear the shadows move, and the empty rooms don't look quite so empty anymore. But at night, I can still hear the whispers. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I catch myself understanding what they're saying. That's when I know that whatever we encountered in Briarwood didn't let us leave empty-handed. Part of it came with us, and it's patient. So patient. It's just waiting for us to return. When my great-uncle Arthur passed away, I wasn't expecting to inherit anything. He was a distant relative I'd only met twice, at family reunions where he'd sat in the corner, fingers drumming an endless rhythm on his knee while he stared into space. But when the thick cream envelope arrived, embossed with the name of a lawyer I'd never heard of, I found myself the unexpected owner of a decaying concert hall in the middle of rural Pennsylvania. "This isn't just some rundown building," the lawyer said when I called, his voice carrying an odd tension I couldn't quite place. "The place has history. Your uncle, he was its caretaker for 40 years, never missed a day." The Briarwood Philharmonic Hall had been built in the early 1900s, a monument to classical music rising incongruously from an otherwise blue-collar town. Its red brick walls and elaborate cornices had once stood proud against the sky, a beacon of culture in a sea of factory smoke and coal dust. But after the orchestra disbanded in the 1950s, the building had fallen into disrepair. A few attempts had been made to restore it, my great-uncles included, I supposed. But nothing stuck. Now, it sat forgotten at the end of a weed-choked street, waiting for me to decide its fate. As a struggling musician myself, scratching out a living playing wedding gigs and teaching piano to disinterested children, I wasn't exactly rolling in money. Still, the idea of turning the hall into a community space appealed to me. Maybe it was the romantic in me, or maybe it was the peculiar emphasis in the lawyer's voice when he spoke about its history. Whatever the reason, I loaded my car with a few essentials: sleeping bag, toolbox, battery-powered lantern, and made the 6-hour drive to Briarwood. I figured I'd take a look, assess the damage, and decide if the place was worth salvaging. The hall was exactly what I expected, yet somehow more. A hulking brick edifice with broken windows that gaped like toothless mouths, and sagging awnings that fluttered weakly in the autumn wind. The brass handles on the main doors were tarnished, nearly black, but they turned smoothly, as if recently oiled. The air inside was stale, carrying the faint scent of mildew and something else, something sweeter, like rosin and old wood. Sunlight streamed through the gaps in the roof, dust motes dancing in the golden beams, illuminating rows of dusty seats upholstered in faded crimson velvet. The stage dominated the far end, its wooden boards worn smooth by countless feet. At its center stood a grand piano, its ebony surface dulled with age, but somehow unmarred by the decay that touched everything else. Still, there was potential. The acoustics, even in its ruined state, were incredible. My footsteps echoed in a way that sent a thrill down my spine, each sound bouncing back fuller, richer, as if the walls themselves were hungry for music. "This could work," I murmured, my voice carrying to every corner of the hall. I could imagine it alive again with music and laughter, the seats filled, the stage lit. The thought made me smile, though something about my voice's echo made the smile feel forced. I spent the day exploring, snapping photos of water damage and structural issues, jotting down ideas in my notebook. The building was larger than it appeared from outside, full of narrow corridors and unexpected rooms, practice spaces, storage closets, a green room with mirrors still hanging crookedly on the walls. By the time evening fell, painting the dusty windows in shades of amber and purple, I was exhausted but oddly energized. I set up a cot in one of the smaller rooms that had likely been an office, its walls still lined with faded playbills and yellowed newspaper clippings. As darkness enveloped the hall, the silence became oppressive, pressing against my ears like cotton wool. Even in its decayed state, the building had a presence, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something I couldn't quite understand. Around midnight, I woke to a faint sound that seemed to seep through the walls themselves. At first, I thought it was the wind finding its way through the broken windows. But as I listened, heart suddenly pounding, I realized it was music. Soft, tentative notes, like someone plucking a violin string with uncertain fingers. I sat up, sleeping bag rustling loudly in the silence between notes, straining to hear more. The sound grew stronger, gathering confidence, accompanied by a low hum that resonated through the walls. It wasn't just a violin. It was an entire orchestra, the instruments joining one by one. First strings, then woodwinds, finally brass, building into something that made my chest ache with its beauty. I grabbed my flashlight, hands trembling slightly, and crept into the main hall. The stage was empty, the piano untouched, its keys gleaming dully in my flashlight beam. But the music filled the air, rising and falling in waves that seemed to have physical presence. Violins soared above cello's mournful undertones. Woodwinds wove complex harmonies, and beneath it all, a brass section added depth that made the floor vibrate beneath my feet. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaky, barely audible above the symphony that surrounded me. "Is anyone there?" The music stopped abruptly, the final notes hanging in the air like frost before dissipating. The silence that followed was absolute, crushing. I swept the flashlight across the room, its beam catching dust motes and shadow. But there was nothing. No musicians, no instruments. Just rows of empty seats and the faint creak of the building settling back into its slumber. I told myself it was my imagination, maybe an auditory hallucination brought on by fatigue and the building's remarkable acoustics. The mind plays tricks in old places, especially at night. I returned to the office, locked the door, though the lock was so old I doubted it would stop anyone, and tried to sleep. But the melody stayed with me, looping endlessly in my mind, beautiful and somehow sorrowful in a way I couldn't quite define. The next morning, determined to dismiss the previous night's experience as nothing more than an overactive imagination, I explored the backstage area. Most of it was a mess of broken chairs, splintered wood, and forgotten props draped in cobwebs. But in one corner, beneath a dusty tarp that felt oddly warm to the touch, I found something incredible. Instruments. They were arranged carefully, almost reverently, on shelves built into the wall. There were violins with strings that gleamed like new, cellos their wood glowing with a deep inner light, even a bassoon that looked as if it had just come from the manufacturer. They were in remarkable condition, considering their age. Too remarkable, a small voice in my mind whispered. I picked up a violin, running my fingers over its strings. It was pristine, its surface polished to a sheen that seemed to drink in the light. As I examined the instruments, placing each one carefully back exactly as I'd found it, I noticed something odd. Each one bore a name, engraved delicately near the base in flowing script that seemed to shift slightly when I wasn't looking directly at it. Elena March read the violin in my hands. "Samuel Harlow," said the cello leaning against the wall. "Michael Chen," declared the bassoon. "Probably members of the old orchestra," I muttered, though the words felt hollow in the dusty air. It seemed like a touching tribute, though the names stirred a faint unease I couldn't place, like a half-remembered nightmare. That night, the music returned. This time, it wasn't soft or tentative. It was loud, confident, resonating through the hall like a live performance. I stood in the center aisle, my feet rooted to the spot, staring at the empty stage as the music swelled around me. The melody was the same as before, but now I could feel it physically, vibrating through the floorboards and the air itself, wrapping around me like invisible hands. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice swallowed by the music that seemed to pour from every shadow, every crack in the walls. "Show yourselves." Then, just as before, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, ringing in my ears like a scream. The next day, hands shaking slightly as I sipped coffee from a paper cup, I decided to investigate. I visited the town's library, a small brick building that smelled of old paper and furniture polish, hoping to learn more about the hall's history. The librarian, an elderly woman with silver hair and a kind smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, was more than happy to help. Ah, the Briarwood Hall, she said, pulling out a dusty ledger with hands that trembled slightly. It was the pride of our town back in the day. Such beautiful music they made. What happened to the orchestra? I asked, watching her face carefully. Why did they disband? She hesitated, her expression darkening like a cloud passing over the sun. Tragedy, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. In 1953, during their final performance, Tchaikovsky's Symphony No. 1. 6. The Pathétique, there was a fire. It started backstage, in the storage area where they kept the extra chairs, spread quickly through those old wooden walls. The room seemed to tilt as her words sank in, the fluorescent lights overhead flickering slightly. Did everyone get out? She shook her head slowly, her fingers tracing the edges of the ledger. Most of the audience escaped, but the orchestra, they kept playing, you see. The conductor, Marcus Reynolds his name was, he knew panic would kill more than the fire. So they kept playing, even as the smoke filled the hall. They never made it out. They all died? My voice sounded strange in my ears, distant and hollow. She nodded solemnly, pulling out a yellowed program from that final night. Everyone. They found them just as they were, instruments still in hand, arranged on stage as if they were merely pausing between movements. I asked for names, though I already knew what I would see. When she laid the program on the table between us, my blood ran cold. Every name matched the ones engraved on the instruments I'd found. Elena March, first violin. Samuel Harlow, principal cello. Michael Chen, bassoon. The list went on, 30 names in total, each one corresponding to an instrument I'd seen carefully preserved backstage. That night I returned to the hall, armed with my camera and an old digital recorder. I had to know if what I was hearing was real, if there was some rational explanation for the music that seemed to live in the building's bones. I set up the recorder in the center aisle and positioned the camera to face the stage. Then I waited, watching the shadows lengthen as night crept in through the broken windows. The music began at exactly midnight, swelling from a faint whisper to a full-blown symphony. I recognized it now. Tchaikovsky's Sixth, the final movement that speaks of acceptance and death. I sat frozen in one of the dusty seats, gripping the arms so tightly my knuckles turned white as the melody washed over me. I felt it before I saw it, a shift in the air, a subtle movement in the shadows that seemed to pulse in time with the music. The rows of seats around me seemed fuller, as though an audience had materialized from the darkness itself. My camera's screen showed nothing but blackness, yet I could swear I saw faces, blurred and indistinct, glowing faintly like foxfire, watching the stage with rapt attention. The music reached a crescendo, the invisible orchestra playing with a passion that made my heart race and my breath catch. The temperature dropped suddenly, frost forming on the camera's lens, and in that moment, I thought I saw them. Figures on the stage, transparent as smoke but unmistakably human, bowing and blowing and drawing music from instruments that gleamed with an inner light. I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted, leaving my equipment behind, not stopping until I reached my car. I drove through the night, the melody following me like a shadow, playing endlessly in my mind. I never returned to Briarwood Hall. When I played back the recorder later, all I heard was static, punctuated by faint whispers I couldn't quite decipher. The camera showed nothing but an empty stage, though occasionally a strange light would flicker across the frame, like sunlight reflecting off polished wood. I sold the hall to a preservation society, leaving them to decide its fate. But sometimes, late at night when the world is quiet, I think about the music, the way it wrapped around me like a shroud, haunting and beautiful, and somehow alive. I wonder if the orchestra is still playing, unseen and forgotten, waiting for someone who understands their final melody. If you ever find yourself in Briarwood, don't go near the hall at night. The music will draw you in, as it drew me, as it perhaps drew my great-uncle Arthur for 40 years. And once you hear it, once it settles into your bones and your dreams, you'll never forget. Some melodies are meant to be eternal, played by those who loved music more than life itself. It started as an accident. During a routine infrastructure project in Westfield, a mid-sized city known more for its endless sprawl of shopping centers than its history, a construction crew struck something unexpected. The morning had begun like any other, the rhythmic pounding of jackhammers breaking through weathered asphalt, the acrid smell of diesel fumes hanging in the humid summer air. None of the workers could have anticipated that their mundane task of replacing aging water mains would unearth something that would haunt the city for years to come. Beneath a stretch of cracked asphalt, their jackhammers broke through into a hidden underground chamber, the ground giving way with an ominous groan that echoed through the surrounding streets. The local news called it a historical treasure, though archaeologists were hesitant to confirm what exactly the chamber was. The media descended like vultures, their cameras flashing in the gray morning light as city officials scrambled to secure the site. Local historians spoke of forgotten Civil War bunkers, abandoned prohibition tunnels, or perhaps a forgotten section of the city's original underground infrastructure. Most of the chamber was empty, save for a few rusted tools and broken jars, their contents long since turned to dust. But etched into the walls was something far more intriguing: an intricate series of maps spanning centuries. The markings were so precise, so meticulous, that historians quickly identified them as the work of a master cartographer. What baffled them, however, was how the maps depicted not only ancient landmarks, but also locations that hadn't existed until decades after the chamber was presumably sealed. The discovery sent ripples through the academic community, challenging everything we thought we knew about the city's history. I was assigned to the project as a researcher from the State Historical Society, eager to uncover the mystery behind the maps. My background in cartography made me a natural fit, or so I thought. My colleagues envied my assignment, seeing it as a career-defining opportunity. If only they knew what awaited in those subterranean depths. By the end, I'd wish I'd never seen them. I arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning, the kind of day that turns the world into shades of gray. The construction site had been transformed into a makeshift archaeological dig, with portable floodlights casting harsh shadows across the muddy ground. White tents dotted the area like mushrooms, housing various pieces of scientific equipment and carefully labeled artifacts. The chamber was sealed off with caution tape, but a narrow staircase led down into its depths. Each step was carved directly into the bedrock, worn smooth by what must have been years of use. The air grew colder with each step, the damp stone walls pressing in on either side. The temperature dropped so dramatically that my breath began to fog in front of me, despite the summer heat above. Inside, the chamber was silent, the kind of silence that feels alive, that seems to watch and wait. The maps covered nearly every inch of the walls, carved with incredible detail. Rivers, mountains, city streets, they were all there, spanning eras and styles. Some were crude and ancient, their lines deep and weathered, while others were so finely detailed they could have been drafted yesterday. My flashlight revealed the faint shimmer of embedded pigments, suggesting the maps had once been painted in vibrant colors. Traces of gold leaf still clung to certain landmarks, catching the light like dying stars. "Beautiful, aren't they?" asked Dr. Palmer, the project lead, as he entered the chamber behind me. His footsteps echoed strangely, as if the sound was coming from multiple directions at once. He was a tall, thin man, with wire-rimmed glasses that caught the beam of his headlamp, creating unsettling reflections in the darkness. "Incredible," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. The chamber seemed to demand silence, like a church or a tomb. But how is it possible? The dates don't match up. These features, these streets, some of them shouldn't exist yet. He nodded grimly, his shadows dancing across the wall maps like phantom cartographers. That's what we're here to figure out. Let me know if you find anything unusual. The word lingered in the air as he walked off, leaving me to examine the maps in solitude. His footsteps faded, but the echoes seemed to continue long after he should have reached the surface. As the days passed, I became more engrossed in the maps. There were hundreds, layered upon each other in a chaotic but strangely deliberate manner. It was as if the cartographer had tried to map the world not as it was, but as it would become. The more I studied them, the more I noticed peculiar details, impossible intersections, roads that seemed to loop back on themselves in ways that defied geometry, and landmarks that appeared in multiple places at once, as if the very fabric of space was being warped. One map showed the city of Westfield in its infancy, marked with dirt roads and sparse buildings. The paper-thin lines captured every detail of the early settlement, down to the individual trees that once lined Main Street. Beside it, etched with the same precision, was a map of Westfield's modern layout, including streets that hadn't been constructed until the 1990s. The shopping centers, the subdivisions, even the new highway bypass, all were there, waiting to be built, like a blueprint of the future carved in stone. On another wall, a map detailed a dense jungle, its boundaries marked with peculiar symbols that seemed to shift and change. When I cross-referenced it with satellite images, I discovered it matched a region in South America, but the area had only been surveyed for the first time in 2015. The level of detail was impossible, showing hidden temples and underground rivers that modern technology was just beginning to uncover. I told myself it was coincidence, the product of overzealous interpretation. Perhaps the maps were simply speculative, the work of an imaginative mind trying to predict future development. But deep down, I knew there was more to it. These maps weren't just historical artifacts. They were predictions. And as I would soon discover, they were still actively charting courses yet to come. The first truly disturbing discovery came on the fourth day. I'd been sketching one of the walls, a meticulous diagram of interconnected roads, when I noticed something faint carved near the bottom edge. The chamber had grown colder, the air thick with an inexplicable tension. My pencil trembled slightly as I leaned closer, squinting in the artificial light. It was a name, Catherine Lewis, my name. I froze, my pencil hovering in midair. The letters were unmistakable, etched as clearly as any street or landmark. The strokes looked fresh, the stone around them lighter than the surrounding surface, as if they had been carved recently. Next to my name was a tiny figure, almost like a stick person, standing on a bridge. The figure was crude, but somehow unsettling, its proportions slightly wrong in a way I couldn't quite define. The problem was, I'd never seen that bridge before. It wasn't part of Westfield, or any other location I recognized. The structure in the carving was distinctive, an unusual arch design with elaborate supports that reminded me of Gothic architecture. I traced my fingers over the carving, my pulse quickening. The stone was cold, much colder than the surrounding wall, as if the carving itself was drawing heat from my skin. Was this some sort of prank? Had one of the other researchers done this to mess with me? I told no one, not yet. The rational part of my mind insisted there must be a logical explanation, but another part, the part that still feared dark corners and unexplained noises, knew better. The next few nights were restless. I dreamed of endless corridors lined with maps, each one more complex than the last. The dreams were vivid, saturated with impossible colors and geometric patterns that shouldn't exist in three-dimensional space. In my dreams, the maps moved, the lines shifting and rearranging themselves like living organisms. Cities grew and died like bacterial colonies. Roads twisted like serpents, and landmarks blinked in and out of existence, like stars going nova. I would wake in a cold sweat, the sensation of being watched lingering long after I opened my eyes. My bedroom walls seemed to pulse with phantom cartography, and more than once I caught myself tracing invisible maps on my ceiling in the pre-dawn darkness. By the 6th day, I noticed the maps had started to change. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light or my own overactive imagination. But as I compared my sketches to the originals, the discrepancies became undeniable. Streets had shifted position, appearing in slightly different locations each day. Landmarks had disappeared entirely, leaving behind blank spaces that seemed darker than the surrounding stone. On one wall, a river I had sketched just the day before was now gone, replaced by a jagged fault line that seemed to throb with faint luminescence in the beam of my flashlight. It didn't make sense. Maps didn't change, not like this. Each morning, I would arrive to find subtle alterations, a new alley here, a missing building there. The changes were small enough that I could almost convince myself I was misremembering the previous day's details. Almost. Dr. Palmer dismissed my concerns as exhaustion, but I could see the unease in his eyes. He stopped coming down to the chamber as frequently, preferring to review our findings from the safety of his office above ground. Other researchers were noticing small inconsistencies too, though no one wanted to admit it aloud. Equipment malfunctioned with increasing frequency. Batteries died unexpectedly. Measurements refused to remain consistent, and photographs came out blurred or distorted, as if the maps themselves were refusing to be documented. Late one evening, after the rest of the team had left, I descended into the chamber alone. The air was different at night, heavier somehow, as if the darkness had substance. I needed answers. Armed with a camera and my sketchbook, I began documenting every inch of the maps, hoping to catch the changes in real time. The beam of my flashlight seemed weaker than usual, barely penetrating the shadows that gathered in the corners like living things. That's when I found it. On the farthest wall, half hidden beneath layers of dust, was a map I hadn't noticed before. It was incomplete, the lines faint and tentative, as though the cartographer had been interrupted mid-stroke. But the layout was unmistakable. It was the chamber itself, etched with chilling accuracy. Every crack, every imperfection in the walls was recorded in perfect detail. The map showed not just the chamber, but the entire network of tunnels and spaces around it. Passages that, according to city records, didn't exist. At the center of the map was a tiny figure, standing alone. The proportions were wrong, just like the figure next to my name, but now I could see why. The limbs were too long, the head slightly misshapen, as if whatever had drawn it had never seen a human being up close. My flashlight flickered, plunging the chamber into darkness. The silence became absolute, pressing against my eardrums like a physical force. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for the light, my fingers numb with cold. When it finally came back on, the map had changed. The figure was no longer alone. Tiny, featureless figures surrounded it now, their outlines sharp and angular, like a jagged shadow. They seemed to face the central figure, their blank forms somehow conveying a sense of hunger, of anticipation. I stumbled backward, the beam of my flashlight darting across the walls. The maps seemed to ripple, their lines shifting and twisting like veins under translucent skin. In the dancing light, I could have sworn I saw the figures move, their angular forms taking a synchronous step toward the center. I ran. The chamber was sealed the next morning. Officially, the team cited concerns about structural stability, but I knew better. Everyone had seen something, though none of us could articulate it. The construction company filled the entrance with concrete, and the city quickly approved plans for a parking structure over the site. We left without fanfare, our research incomplete, our findings sealed away in confidential reports that would never see the light of day. I tried to forget about the maps, but they refused to leave me alone. They haunted my dreams, their impossible geometries bleeding into my waking life. I began to notice patterns everywhere, in the cracks of sidewalks, in the arrangement of streets, in the very architecture of the city itself. It was as if the maps had taught me to see the world differently, to recognize designs that had always been there, waiting to be discovered. Months later, I was walking across the 12th Street Bridge on my way home from work when I stopped dead in my tracks. The bridge, the one from the map with my name, was identical. Every beam, every support, every angle matched the carving perfectly. But the bridge wasn't new. It had been there for years. I had crossed it hundreds of times without making the connection. Now, standing in the exact spot where that crude figure had stood in the map, I felt a terrible certainty settle over me. My knees buckled, and I gripped the railing for support, the metal cold beneath my fingers despite the warm evening air. That night, I pored over my sketches, comparing them to photos of the bridge. There was no denying it. The maps weren't just showing what would be, they were showing what had always been, what would always be, as if past, present, and future were simply different layers of the same eternal map. The maps weren't just predicting places, they were predicting events, and somewhere in that labyrinth of carved stone, my story, everyone's story, was already written. Since then, I've tried to avoid the chamber, the maps, and anything remotely connected to them. I moved to a different city, took a different job, tried to lose myself in the anonymity of urban life. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I dream of corridors lined with shifting lines and impossible landscapes. I dream of the jagged shadows that surrounded me, growing closer with each passing moment. In these dreams, I'm always standing on that bridge, watching as the angular figures emerge from the darkness below, their forms distorted by the rippling water. I've started to wonder if the maps are still changing, deep beneath Westfield's streets, if they're recording my steps, my choices, my future, and I wonder what happens when they run out of space. What new geometries will they create? What territories remain to be charted in their endless quest to map not just space, but time itself? If you ever find yourself in Westfield, don't go looking for the chamber. Some maps are meant to be forgotten, some territories left unexplored. But if you pass by the construction site, now hidden beneath a mundane parking structure, listen carefully. You might hear it. The sound of stone being carved, of lines being drawn, of futures being written. And whatever you do, don't look too closely at the cracks in the pavement. They might just be forming a map of their own. The monastery had no name, at least none that anyone in the nearby villages would speak aloud. High in the Andes, perched on the edge of a sheer cliff that plunged thousands of feet into a mist-shrouded valley, it had been abandoned for centuries, its crumbling stone walls swallowed by moss and time. The ancient stones, weathered by countless seasons of rain and wind, seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy that made even the hardiest mountain guides avoid its shadow. To the locals, it was cursed, a place where the veil between worlds had worn thin. To me, it was an opportunity. I was on assignment to photograph ancient ruins for a travel magazine, and the monastery was exactly the kind of hidden gem that would make a perfect feature. The editor wanted something remote and atmospheric, something that would capture readers' imaginations and transport them to places they'd never dare visit themselves. This place checked every box: the isolation, the history, the mystery. It was perfect. When I mentioned my plans to the villagers in the small settlement at the mountain's base, their reactions were less enthusiastic. "You shouldn't go there," warned an elderly woman at the marketplace, her weathered hands trembling as she gripped my arm with surprising strength. Her eyes, clouded with cataracts but bright with fear, searched my face. Bad things happened there, things that echo through time. What kind of bad things? I asked, genuinely curious. I'd heard similar warnings before at other sites. Local superstitions were common around ancient ruins. She shook her head, her silver hair catching the weak mountain sunlight. Her eyes clouded not just with fear now, but with something deeper, a knowledge that seemed to pain her. The kind you don't bring back with you, the kind that follows. She crossed herself quickly, mumbling a prayer in Spanish that I couldn't quite catch. I brushed off her warnings, chalking them up to superstition and folklore. But as I made my way up the winding mountain trail the next morning, her words clung to me like the damp fog that rolled in with the afternoon. The air grew thinner with each step, the path steeper, until my lungs burned with the effort. The vegetation changed as I climbed, lush mountain forests giving way to scraggly bushes and finally bare rock. The silence grew deeper, more absolute, broken only by my labored breathing and the occasional scatter of loose stones beneath my boots. Finally, after hours of climbing, the monastery loomed before me, emerging from the mist like a ship breaking through waves. The sight stopped me in my tracks. The main structure was still intact, its massive stone walls defying the centuries of erosion and neglect. Built from local granite that had darkened with age, it seemed to absorb what little sunlight filtered through the clouds. A broken archway marked the entrance, its edges adorned with faded carvings of saints and symbols I didn't recognize. Figures with elongated limbs and faces that seemed to shift. I paused to catch my breath, marveling at the sheer scale of it. Even in ruin, it was beautiful in a way that made my skin crawl. As I stepped inside, the temperature dropped noticeably. The air was colder here, heavier, as though the centuries of isolation had condensed into something physical. The sound of the wind outside was muffled, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. My footsteps echoed faintly as I moved through the main hall, where crumbling wooden pews faced an altar draped in shadows. The faint smell of mildew mixed with something sharper, like burned wood, and an underlying metallic tang that reminded me of old blood. The hall itself was massive, its ceiling lost in shadows despite the afternoon light that filtered through broken windows. Dust motes danced in the pale beams, moving in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. The walls were lined with frescoes, their colors faded, but still visible, scenes of religious life that seemed somehow off, though I couldn't immediately say why. The longer I looked at them, the more unsettling they became. The figures were too thin, their poses too rigid, their eyes too wide and staring. I raised my camera and began to shoot, capturing the interplay of light and shadow, the intricate stonework, the remnants of frescoes clinging to the walls. Through my viewfinder, the monastery took on a different character. Shadows deepened, angles sharpened, and details emerged that I hadn't noticed with my naked eye. Faces in the stone, patterns in the decay, shapes in the darkness that seemed to shift between frames. But as I reviewed the photos on my digital screen, something caught my eye. In one of the shots taken of the altar, there was a faint blur, a shadow that hadn't been there in person. I zoomed in, squinting at the screen, my fingers suddenly cold against the camera's metal body. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it looked like a figure, tall and thin, with a hood drawn over where its face should be. I glanced up at the altar, my skin prickling with unease. The shadows hadn't moved, but they felt heavier now, as though watching. The air seemed thicker, charged with an energy that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a quirk of digital photography, and kept shooting. But I found myself checking the screen more frequently, looking for more anomalies, more suggestions of things that shouldn't be there. By the time dusk fell, I'd made my way through most of the monastery, documenting everything from the cloisters to the kitchens. The place was massive, a labyrinth of interconnected halls and rooms, that seemed to spiral endlessly inward. It was easy to lose track of time in the dim light, and when I checked my watch, I realized I'd spent hours wandering through the complex. The light was failing fast, and the temperature was dropping rapidly with the sun. I decided to call it a day and set up camp in one of the smaller chambers near the main hall. It was mostly intact, with a small window that let in just enough light to make it feel less oppressive. The room had probably been a monk's cell once, sparse and simple, with thick walls that blocked most of the wind. As I settled into my sleeping bag, the wind picked up outside, howling faintly through the broken windows. The sound was oddly rhythmic, almost like chanting. I didn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I dreamed of the frescoes on the walls. In my dreams, they were vivid and alive, depicting scenes of suffering that went beyond mere religious devotion. The monks knelt in prayer, as shadowy figures loomed behind them, their faces contorted in anguish that seemed too real, too specific to be mere artistic interpretation. The figures' fingers were too long, their joints bent at impossible angles, their shadows stretching across the walls like reaching hands. I woke in a cold sweat. The images burned into my mind, my heart pounding in my chest. The next morning, I decided to explore the crypt. It wasn't part of my original plan. Underground spaces were always tricky to photograph, but something drew me there, a compulsion I couldn't explain or resist. The entrance to the crypt was hidden behind the altar, a narrow staircase leading down into darkness that seemed to swallow my flashlight beam. The air grew colder with each step, the smell of damp stone stronger, mixed with something else, an organic decay that seemed to coat the back of my throat. My flashlight flickered, casting jagged shadows on the walls as I descended. The stairs were worn smooth by countless feet, though no one had walked them in centuries. The crypt was small, its walls lined with niches where the remains of monks had once been placed. Most of the bones had been removed or stolen over the years, but a few fragments remained, scattered across the floor like discarded puzzle pieces. The fragments seemed wrong somehow, too long, too angular, as though they'd belonged to people whose bodies didn't quite match human proportions. At the far end of the chamber was a statue of a saint, its face obscured by time and what looked like deliberate damage. The longer I looked at it, the more it seemed like the damage was concentrated around the eyes, as though someone had wanted to blind it. I raised my camera to photograph it, but the moment I pressed the shutter, the room seemed to shift. The shadows deepened, becoming almost solid, and the air grew heavier, thick enough to choke on. The faint sound of whispers echoed through the chamber, seeming to come from the walls themselves. I spun around, the flashlight beam darting across the walls. There was no one there, just the stone, the dust, and the faint sound of my own breathing, which seemed too loud in the enclosed space. But the whispers continued, faint and insistent. They weren't in English or Spanish, but something older, something that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. The words seemed to slither through the air, carrying meanings that my mind refused to process. I stumbled back toward the stairs, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, and fled to the surface. The sunlight seemed weak and watery after the darkness below, offering little comfort. I spent the rest of the day in the open air, photographing the exterior of the monastery and the surrounding landscape. The mountains stretched endlessly in every direction, peaks disappearing into clouds that seemed to gather more thickly around the monastery. I didn't go back inside until the sun began to set, and even then, I stuck to the main hall, avoiding the crypt entirely. But I could feel it below me, like a weight pulling at my thoughts. That night, the dreams returned. This time, they were more vivid, more invasive. I dreamed of the monks again, their faces pale and gaunt, their eyes wide with terror. They were chanting, their voices rising in unison as the shadowy figures surrounded them. But now, I could see the figures clearly, tall, impossibly thin beings with too many joints and faces that weren't faces at all. The frescoes on the walls seemed to bleed, their colors dripping onto the floor in thick, dark streams that moved against gravity, flowing upward and across the ceiling in patterns that hurt to look at. I woke to the sound of chanting. For a moment, I thought I was still dreaming, but the sound was real, low and guttural, echoing faintly through the halls. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, as though the stones themselves were singing. I grabbed my flashlight and camera, my hands trembling so badly I nearly dropped them, and stepped into the corridor. The chanting grew louder as I approached the main hall, the words clearer, but no more comprehensible. My flashlight flickered, the beam struggling against a darkness that seemed almost solid. When I reached the hall, I froze. The frescoes were glowing. Their colors were vibrant, illuminated by some unseen light that seemed to pulse in time with the chanting. The monks in the paintings seemed to move, their faces twisting in anguish as the shadows around them closed in. The figures I dreamed of were there too, more real than any painting should be, their impossible limbs reaching out from the walls. The chanting filled the air, oppressive and deafening, and I could feel it in my bones, restructuring something fundamental about reality itself. I raised my camera, desperate to capture what I was seeing, to prove to myself later that it was real. But as I pressed the shutter, the light in the hall went out, plunging me into complete darkness. The chanting stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence that felt like a physical presence. In that silence, I heard something move, a sound like dry leaves sliding across stone, coming from all around me. I ran. I left the monastery at first light, abandoning my equipment, except for the camera slung around my neck. The narrow mountain trail felt endless, the weight of the previous night pressing down on me with every step. The fog seemed thicker than before, and more than once I lost the trail, only to find myself inexplicably turned back toward the monastery. It took hours to finally break free of its influence. When I reached the village, I tried to explain what had happened, but the locals wouldn't listen. They turned away, crossing themselves and muttering prayers. The elderly woman who had warned me shook her head, her expression grim but unsurprised. "I told you," she said, her voice heavy with ancient knowledge. "Bad things happened there. Bad things are still happening there." I sent my photos to the magazine but received no response. When I checked the files later, every image taken inside the monastery was corrupted, not just blurry or underexposed, but distorted in ways that digital images shouldn't be. Faces appeared in the static. Patterns emerged in the corruption that made my eyes water and my head spin. The only ones that remained clear were the exterior shots, the ones taken in daylight, though even in those, the shadows seemed wrong, too dark and too deep. Months later, I still dream of the monastery. The frescoes, the chanting, the shadows, they haunt me. Sometimes I wake to find my room cold and dark, the air heavy with that same oppressive silence. I've stopped photographing ruins, stopped traveling altogether. Some places, I've learned, are meant to be left alone. Some sanctuaries preserve things that were never meant to be holy. If you ever find yourself in the Andes and someone mentions a monastery without a name, take my advice. Don't go looking for it. And if you find it anyway, don't go inside. The things that dwell there have waited centuries for visitors, and they're very, very patient.